Oh, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Thank you for coming to join this Leading Conversations webinar today with my guest, Mark McCrindle, which I'll introduce very shortly. If this is the first time you've attended this webinar series, again, welcome. The idea behind these series of webinars is, as we navigate through this very unusual time, I wanted to bring together a range of experts and CEOs so we could really have a conversation about what we're all experiencing going through this journey. And because everyone has a particular take and a particular perspective on what we're experiencing now. Great to have you on board. I am going to invite you to use the Q&A to ask questions. Jenny's going to be monitoring the Q&A. Jenny, are you there? Just want to make sure you're there.
I'm here, Anthony. So yes, put your questions into the Q&A. If there's anything you want to ask me specifically, just put that into the chat box and I can respond online to you.
Great. So Jenny will do any technical issues, but please put any questions into the Q&A. Mark and I will start a conversation, and then midway through, I'll kind of go back to the questions. So really are looking for your input and happy to address your specific questions throughout this session today. Was there anything else, Jenny, I needed to bring in terms of admin? I think I've covered it. Otherwise, we may as well start. Any other?
I think you're ready to start, Anthony. Covered it all.
Awesome, great. And again, thanks and welcome everyone for joining us today. I'd really like to now introduce my fellow presenter, Mark McCrindle. Many of you whom you would know Mark McCrindle, I'm sure. Welcome, Mark. Fantastic to have you on board. Welcome. Mark is obviously a well-known social researcher, TEDx speaker, best-selling author, social analyst with an international following. Passions lie in tracking emerging issues, researching social trends, and analyzing customer segments. So welcome, Mark. This must be like Christmas for you, this situation that we're going through, because it's like the perfect social experiment, isn't it?
It is. It's amazing to be a social researcher in a once-in-a-lifetime, situation like this, as tough as it is for everyone and as big as some of the implications are. For us to study society, communities in a time like this is amazing, because what we're going through is not only far-reaching in its impact, it's impacting all of us in all of our areas: work, study, home, shopping, relationships, memberships. It's also global, and the reach of it is phenomenal. And so, we are finding it fascinating to see what's changed and how we're changing as a society and what will remain changed after this whole thing.
Well, we might come back to that point that you mentioned about that we're in global, because that's what I talk about, that this is a unique time. And I think about it in terms of strategy review, for example, and say this is unique because not only are you as a business owner and a board rethinking your strategy, but your whole value chain is doing it exactly at the same time. Your suppliers and your customers are all reassessing value. So we might come back to that point a little bit later, because I'd love to understand if you have a perspective on how the behaviors and the experience in Australia might be different than in other markets. But let's come back to that question if we think that's useful to our audience. So look, Mark, you've been doing some research right in this space. Perhaps we could open up with you just sharing what is the research telling you in terms of I guess we're kind of all conscious of the behaviors, but what's likely to stick, and what are people feeling about what's going on?
Well, uncertainty and anxiety have been the dominating emotions for the last 2 months. Australians have been very compliant with the measures put in place by the government, with the public health messaging. And 98% of Australians have practiced social distancing, phenomenal compliance. Now, the models that show the best outcome model in 90% compliance. So the fact that we've got well above that is pretty phenomenal. And that's why we're seeing such great results at a national level. 88% of Australians have limited going out to public places or shopping, for example, in this time. So again, almost total compliance and self-isolation, which has had the benefits of the great outcomes that we've had here in Australia. And that's because, you know, Australians have been compliant. We're not particularly a government-fearing, authority-fearing nation. We like a bit of our own independence and a bit of pushback. We hear that, oh, you know, trust in government or politicians is low, but actually Australians have seen firsthand through the news, you know, the impacts in other countries. They haven't wanted to be there. They've taken the health threat seriously, and so they have complied. And this question we asked in this survey that just was closed off on the weekend, we asked 1,000 Australians, has it been worth it? The pain, the shutdown, the problems, the finances, and more than 9 in 10 say yes, it has been. In fact, it was about 93% say it's been worth it. And the same number, 9 in 10, say that our government has performed, has managed it better than governments in comparable nations. So pretty good tick of health from how our leaders have handled it.
That's great. Interesting. That touches into another nerve that I've seen, that we really do have now very much a shared purpose, in the sense that there is clearly there's a common enemy. But I'm also seeing that at the enterprise level too, that there is this perspective of, you know, we're all in this together, and it's uncertain for business, it's uncertain for people, it's uncertain for the community, it's uncertain for government. And so there's I guess almost a forgiveness or a willingness for people to be more accommodating about perhaps some of the drastic changes that some organizations have to go through. I don't know if that's come through in any of the research that you've been doing.
It has, and the speed at which it hit our organizations, hit all of us in business. The ABS ran a study in early April, just looking at the March impacts, and just in March, what happened was 66% of Australian businesses saw reduced cash flow, compared to about 6% who saw an increase. So the rest saw no change, but 2/3 within a month, bang, cash flow impacted. 47% changed staff arrangements. Almost half of all businesses within a month were changing staff arrangements, stand downs, redundancies, or changed working arrangements. 38% moved into renegotiating rent or lease, again, within the first 4 weeks of it. So we responded very quickly. I was happy to see almost half of all businesses, again, in that first month, innovated how they deliver their products or services, or what they're offering. And that's part of that Aussie mindset, the can-do nature. You know, we'll get out, we'll face a bushfire, a flood, or a global pandemic, and we will innovate. And so that was good to see that response as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. What about things about the kind of intergenerational aspect? Because obviously this situation is impacting different people in different ways, isn't it? You know, it's impacting baby boomers differently than perhaps that kind of young people that they're coming out of college or looking for work, etc. I mean, how do the kind of generations respond to the situation differently? And I'm thinking again how this might then relate to businesses and to value and opportunity for products and services beyond that.
Well, the fascinating area, Anthony, to look at the generational responses, and I should point out to all of those tuning in that in the chat area, there's a link to get the full report. Right. And we're just finishing up. That's a link to the report that was completed in the first wave of research. So it was up a couple of weeks ago. We've just finished off on the weekend this next wave of research. And so that report you'll get at the same site in about a week. But I've got the results on that. And we asked Australians, again, last week and finished off over the weekend, what's the dominant response you're feeling? Now, I mentioned before it was fear and anxiety was at the top. For Generation Z, so those in their 20s, anxious was still the #1 response. But for the builders generation and the baby boomers, so those in their 50s and 60s plus, they said hopeful as the top response. In fact, the older generations stated hopeful at twice the rate as the younger generations, and the younger generations exhibited anxiety at twice the rate of the older. So what this tells us is that the older generations have a broader life context into which to put such things. They've seen recessions, they've heard stories of tough times, maybe of great depressions or wars from parents or grandparents. And so that resilience that they show is greater. But then we looked at how you've been going on the financial side and on the health side. And the younger generations have greater resilience, they say, financially and physically, whereas the older generations we know are more vulnerable to COVID because of their age. We all have seen that in the results, and also more vulnerable financially with superannuation or retirement impacts because they don't have as long to bounce back financially. So interesting that while the younger generations were the most resilient financially and physically, they were the least resilient emotionally. The older generations had the emotional resilience, the hopefulness, even though they were more exposed to the virus as a health perspective. And all of that tells us that there is an intergenerational solution here. You know, the older generation can give comfort, support, a bit of encouragement to the younger ones. The younger ones can, I think, get out there and bring out some innovations and adaptations in this time technologically. But across all of the generations, I think we have a solution.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And how that's particularly of interest to me is in terms of this sense of what it means for the perception of value. For when I think of products and services, the brands, everybody on this call are probably CEOs running a business or not-for-profit organizations, etc. And people are reassessing their perspective of value, and behaviors have changed. We've seen that. I'm kind of really interested in how this different generational perspective and emotional response, particularly as you said, will impact that sense of value and flow into behaviors, and therefore how might businesses kind of respond to it? I don't know if you've got any perspective on that.
Well, just that we not only have to innovate as we're doing here using technology for this conversation, Anthony, and businesses have been doing that, but we do need to be aware of the customer, put ourselves in their shoes, understand some of the differences in response that we're going to get from customers. You know, the younger generation are quite adept to the contactless payments. But if we put up the sign that says card only, that might alienate some of the older generations that do rely more on the cash. And indeed, there is some skepticism around the technology. The majority of Australians have been downloading the COVID Safe app. So I shouldn't say the majority, but in big numbers we have, edging closer to that 40% mark, which was the target. But there is some skepticism around technology, more amongst an older generation than a younger one. So being tuned into that as businesses with our customers is key. When it comes to the concerns we have about the health aspect, this question, are you concerned about COVID or coronavirus? 2 in 3 Australians are. And if we look at the under 20s versus the over 20s, there was very little difference. So from a health perspective, no one wants to catch it. You know, we're all wanting to maintain the hygiene and those realities. So, you know, in other words, the fixtures of the hand sanitizer at the front desk or in the office, foyer, that's going to be a permanent fixture. Social distancing, resetting up the office as we go back, spacing when we have our meetings, outdoor meetings where we can, walking meetings where that works outdoors. These will, I think, be important for the medium term as we respond. And it's not just for younger or for older, it's actually across the board in that regard.
So that's a really important point, isn't it? And you and I were just having a chat before this webinar started about how it's impacted our businesses. And how effectively we become more efficient by not having to travel so much to meetings, etc. So we can be really effective, and our teams are working well at the moment. I mean, I guess that again depends on industries. Obviously, if in the hospitality space, it's very different than if in the professional services space as we are. But that question around when things become easier, let's say in 3 months or in 6 months' time, the situation eases, etc. What will start to come back, and what will we keep to? As your research pointed to any highlights that we might be able to learn from that?
Yeah, there will be a lot of changes and things that will be here to stay. It was Roosevelt in the lead up to, in the emergence of the Great Depression, who said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Yes. And I think managing that fear is going to be a challenge. As leaders, we need to lead our teams through the fear. We don't want to limit our lives and our businesses to the level of people's fear, to that lowest common denominator. But at the same time, we don't want to push people through that fear that they might have because of their own personal circumstances, their extra caution because of an elderly parent living with them or young children, whatever it may be. So it's walking that balance. To what extent do we lead and help people overcome that? To what extent do we nuance our response? So we've asked Australians this question in the last week, what do you have any reservations as we move back to a working from the office environment? 86% said that they have some or great reservations, but in total, reservations around travelling on public transport. The same number, 86%, very high proportion, said reservations about using work cups and cutlery. So even practical things like that. 83% say some reservations about a communal workspace or multi-hour meetings. 73% have some level of concern around the use of lifts. And so we have to manage that. And not only from a health perspective, we need the social distancing. It's a requirement from the Fair Work Australia, from the Safe Work Australia guidelines. But also we need to manage people's fears, help lead them through it, project confidence and a strong vision of where we're headed, but at the same time, work with our teams as we get back to some level of normality. Now, as you've said, something of the work from home will continue. We found that 7 in 10 Australians said that they think working from home will become a new normal. Yeah. And that's the case. Not everyone every day, but certainly a lot more people a day a week or maybe a day a fortnight. There'll be a lot more of that, and that will be a permanent fixture in our workplace as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to see if we have questions. We talked a lot about anxiety, about fear, and I think leading through that is absolutely right. I mean, we can't eliminate the anxiety or indeed the fear, and we can't eliminate the uncertainty because we're likely to continue with that level of uncertainty for some time. But surely there's some positives that have come from this, and we've highlighted a couple about the common enemy theme. But are there any other kind of key highlights around the sort of the positives that people are talking about? In the recent experience.
Well, very briefly, firstly on work from home, then I'll look to some other ones. But firstly, something is a permanent fixture when it's got an acronym, and WFH is now here to stay. So on the work from home, we asked Australians how they've gone. 82% said they've saved time. Obviously, that's commute, and with that, saved costs. 73% said it's enabled them. These are just those who work from home. It's enabled them to have more time with family. We were thinking about work-life balance, do the lines blur? Do people end up letting their work time bleed into home time and the like? But actually, 65% said their work-life balance is better when working from home. A lot said it's the same, hardly anyone said it's worse. And the other big one is the productivity, and that matters to us as business leaders. And the majority, 51% of those who've worked from home during COVID said their productivity has been better while working from home than it was in the office, and just 20% said it was worse. And I'm sure those 20% are people like me with young kids that have also been learning at home as well, and spouses or partners have been working from home, and the whole thing's been chaotic. And yet, amidst the crunch point of everyone in the household we've largely still found productivity better. The slower pace of life people have appreciated. We haven't been rushing kids here, there and everywhere. We have had our nights free. We've spent more time with family. 1 in 5 Australians say they've built stronger bonds with their household members because of COVID. We also found about 1/3 of Australians have picked up creative pursuits like baking or hobbies. More people have got back into gardening or planted a garden. We found about 1 in 5 said they've got back to traditional pursuits like board games, reading, card games, jigsaw puzzles. So all of that is healthy, because we were so screen obsessed. We had our work day, which was very busy. Then we'd come home and we'd get in front of screens.
Yes. In
this environment, because our whole day was in front of a screen, at the end of the workday, we put the screens away and we actually relate to each other, which has been a very, very much a positive from a social connection perspective. So a lot of those factors Australians are saying they want to keep: a slower pace of life, a more sustainable pace, and indeed those reprioritized values. And we will carry that forward with us. as a community into the future. Notwithstanding the downsides of COVID, there's been a lot of those upsides as well.
Yeah, I love talking to you about this because we all have our own opinions and we all have our anecdotals, but your perspectives are built around research that you've done, which is fantastic, validating what we've done. Okay, Jenny, I think we've got a few questions, so I better jump in and ask questions there. There's so many more questions I could ask Mark, but let's perhaps jump to the Q&A. Jenny, do we have any questions that for us?
We sure do. And the first two are both around innovation. So I'll read them out together and then Mark can perhaps address those as one. So firstly, is there any data on the types of innovation? And secondly, putting aside the businesses that are obviously going to do better, internet companies, online businesses,
yes,
are there traditional businesses that are innovating it and doing it better than they were before COVID?
Great question. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Yes, the ABS tracked this. They were the ones that ran that study looking at what businesses had done in March and their study in early April. And it was two main areas. It was the delivery of your services or products, and it was the actual services or products that you're delivering. So the biggest innovation was in how we're delivering. So in the product space, there's been a lot more online shopping and distribution that way. In the services space, we're all delivering our expertise or our input through the technology, like this very example. So how we deliver both products and services has been the biggest area of innovation, and it took something like COVID to finally get us to use the digital capabilities we've all had in our pockets or on our desks. We're finally doing it to greater efficiency. So that's good to see. Less was the innovation in the actual services or products, but it's early days, and it does take a little bit of time to retool what we offer. Not just how we deliver it. So more to be done there. But Aussies are innovative. Aussie entrepreneurs particularly. I think there'll be a lot more product innovation. I love Winston Churchill's great quote. He knew crisis, having led through the war, and he said, never waste a good crisis. Yes. Never let it go to waste. And that's what I think a lot of business leaders are doing. Getting streamlined, getting efficient, junking the things that were only marginal in the good times anyway, let alone now, and let's retool and slim on down for the future. I think that's a great outcome of something like this.
Yes, excellent. And my perspective certainly is I'm seeing massive innovation now as businesses really do reimagine their perception of value, reimagine their supply chains, reimagine how they engage with their customers and clients. And we talked right at the beginning about this is a global phenomenon. The interesting thing about this is, there are people all around the world doing exactly the same that what we're doing now, sitting in front of the screens, rethinking and reimagining innovation in their business, etc. And it really is, the experience I've had with clients is they're actually finding it much easier to reach out to prospects because there is a desire to engage, and there's a desire to engage with new, and the technology means that we're available, and that because people aren't traveling all over the place, they're now available. So I think there's innovation in value, there's innovation in kind of business model about how we might be able to approach and reach out to customers, and then there's innovation around supply chain too, not least because the situation around freight and shipping, all of which happened in mid-March, which forced organizations to rethink. So my message to all organizations now is to put together what I call that reimagination SWAT team, which is the group of young Turks in an organization, and let them look at every aspect of your business and deconstruct and reconstruct. And from that, there'll be a myriad of ideas that might be just about efficiency improvement, but also can be about business model, but also can be completely about business value. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to do that. And as you said, as Churchill said, don't waste the opportunity. Jenny, any other questions in the chat box for us?
Certainly are quite a few questions. So,
okay.
As well as the self-reporting statistics that Mark quoted, are there any numbers that might indicate an increase or decrease in productivity? So, for example, people are not travelling now to work. Is that showing up as extra productivity?
Yeah. there's not objective data yet. I think it's too early to be able to find that data in terms of output. There was one little study that I was looking at, or reporting on a study of academics publishing, and it shows that the number of peer-reviewed journal articles submitted for publication or review has increased in this period than any other period, like for like period. So that does tell us that if in a knowledge economy, if it's about us sitting there and churning something out, we can actually do it better when we're in our own environment than when we're not. Now, an academic publishing a paper, writing a paper, is a bit different to a lot of our workplaces, even those of us in the knowledge economy, because we actually need the collegiality. That was one downside that we found in the research of Australians working from home. They said they're missing that sometimes spontaneous, unplanned collegiality where an idea spawns an idea, or where you just improve a process because you say, how does this thing work? And they go, oh, no, don't do it like that, like this. You wouldn't plan on it, and you probably wouldn't make a Zoom call to work it out in an offline, in a working from home environment, but in the office, there's those constant innovations that come through a team. So teams do provide productivity. They provide synergy in themselves. Now, they can take time as we have unnecessary conversations or a lot of chit chat, but they also do add productivity. So that is one aspect that we're losing in this. And that's why I think the future will be hybrid, a bit more working from home, but also that gathering place will be here to stay. But yes, to the question, probably a bit early to objectively show the productivity in the workplace just yet.
Other than that, productivity about travel. So one of those SWAT groups I was talking to you about that I'm getting clients to work with through now had a meeting the other day, and one of their key leaders in that group normally spent an hour and a half driving to their office in the city, and they were no longer having to do that. So, I mean, it's blindingly obvious, but it really is a huge benefit. Jenny, I think there's some more questions, aren't there? So jump in and ask some questions. Great questions, by the way, folks. Great questions. Keep them coming.
Mark, what do you imagine will be the effect on commercial and residential properties? So as well as the effects on prices, what do you see happening in terms of usage of property, style, needs, etc.?
Yes, well, I think the demand for property has been well discussed, and I think we're all across that, and there will be a challenge in terms of those prices, in terms of rental returns and yield for a while to come. But the focus of that question that I find the most interesting is how will it change our approach to residential property in the future? Yes. Well, the downsides of the lower cost housing, which is the outer suburban fringe housing, the regional housing, actually has turned out to be a positive in this era. The fact that they are remote, the fact that they are a way away, that they are detached homes actually is a strength. The walkable community that we've seen grow, the unit living, the apartment living, in the CBDs or close to it, has seemed to have a deficit in a time like this, and that is its closeness. The fact there's a cafe there and shared spaces and community living actually is a downside when people are looking to self-isolate. So it's interesting that the downside of the lower cost housing in the regional and outer suburban areas has turned into a positive. And the downside that those more remote places had was the commute time has not been a negative in this era because everyone's working from home or studying from home. So it has been and will be a long-term boost to regional living. People are recognizing that you don't need a house in a capital city anymore to hold down a capital city job. You don't need to worry about the commute. If you can just do the commute 3 or 4 days a week or less, then it's not as big of a deal. And so we'll see a boom to some of those more remote or the outer or middle ring suburbs. It'll have a little bit of an impact on apartment living for a while until we sort of get back over our social phobias. And it will impact on the commercial tenancies for a little while as we readjust what floor space we need for our businesses, probably based on 80% full-time equivalent rather than the 100% that we've had in the past, because 1 in 5 at any point will be working from home. We will value those extra rooms in our homes. The 3-bedder apartment or the 4-bedder house suddenly has value. We didn't know what we were going to do with those extra rooms Now we know, because that's where the home office is, that's where the study for the student is, and we're going to use those spaces more effectively. Open plan living, great idea, and we like the open space, but we've all seen that open plan is not very effective when you've got 2 kids studying and 2 people working in an open plan apartment or house. So we will start to see the benefit of modular housing and design again. And the good old backyard that wasn't getting much of a go for a while is suddenly we're seeing the benefit of it. Bit of sport, bit of fresh air, bit of access to some sunlight. So the bigger balconies, the outdoor spaces, the townhouses, which have their own entry and exit compared to a unit, all of those will see a bit of a benefit post-COVID.
Very interesting. I think the commercial space scenario, isn't it? Because certainly, again, for most offices, everyone's probably looking and going, "Well, I need a lot less space than I did previously, substantially less space." But then, on the opposite side to that perspective is that within offices, people will want more space. So your point about open plan living, the same is true for probably open plan offices, isn't it? Will
Yes.
we move to a the kind of re-emergence of the office frequently,
Yes.
the number of offices per square foot.
That's true. A bit more of that isolation or separate location. Certainly no hot desking or not much now. And again, the easy access is key. We all looked and marveled at those 40-story office blocks, or the offices on the 40th story with the harbour views. But suddenly, as you think about one person per lift use and how long it's going to take to get up to those offices, the walk-up office is suddenly, in of great appeal again. So it's changing even these basic assumptions we used to have.
Yeah. And the reality is this is going to go on for some time, isn't it? In reality, until we've got a vaccine or there's some degree of 80% infection rate effectively, this will go on for some considerable time, I'm sure of it. I really like that idea about the opportunity for the regions now, because there's a massive opportunity for Australia there, I think, in the regions. And if this can be a fillip to that, to drive that, I think that's hugely beneficial. I know we have some more questions, Jenny, so I better come back to the questions. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so let's just try and zoom through.
Yes, Mark's in hot demand. So do you have any data coming in yet about employees' market value post-COVID-19 and how companies are managing these fixed costs in business with so many unknowns on what the marketplace will deliver over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I guess I was hearing their wage rates and impact on that.
Yeah.
I was hearing that.
Well, it's a soft labour market at the moment, of course, particularly come September, when a lot of those JobKeeper roles will actually reach their end and be made redundant. So that's sort of a challenge in all of this. Someone could argue that it's an employer's market. You can keep the wages costs flat, and you've got the pick of the options, and that's certainly going to be the case for a couple of years. I think double-digit unemployment, which is where we're headed, it's going to take a while to come back down. But while that's the data and that might be the read, I would quickly caution against that, because it is the time to look after our staff and reward those who are able to work independently, who show their productivity, who are self-disciplined and can bring results. If we're less in the office, if we're relying on leaner teams, then we need leaders, we need influencers, we need people that are self-directed, rather than those that might come at a lower cost but need that supervision. And that whole hierarchy and in the office and having people in a chain of command, that's not the new way. It's lean teams, it's people working independently and remotely. So they cost money, they need to be well rewarded. So I don't think we're going to save on a per head salary basis. We probably will have leaner teams. So maybe overall the payroll will be similar or less, but we'll probably be needing to reward those who really show their commitment and their results. And the other thing is how we look after people in the tough times is remembered in the good times. Yeah. And this is true of our customers and clients as well.
Correct.
Look after people, invest in them. Don't be opportunistic and think we can get away with it because it'll come back to haunt us later. Let's now build the goodwill with both our teams and our clients, and they'll look after us when the good times roll.
One of the advantages, I think, of this opportunity is as we go through the introspection of looking at our businesses, we have the opportunity to discover what I call the hidden value the things that perhaps were not so prominent and not so in our face when the times were good. And one of the areas of hidden value you just touched on there, which is leadership. And there are what I call emerging leaders. And it's been interesting in conversations to hear about people who are in leadership positions that have actually not been dealing terribly well with the challenges, the fear, the anxiety, and the constant change, etc. Where you've got people that are not in leadership positions but are demonstrating their leadership capability. And I think one of the opportunities for CEOs at the moment is to really ensure that they are nurturing those emerging leaders, because they're going to be the catalyst for change, and they can help the entire organization improve. So thank you. Great questions, by the way. Do we have more questions, Jenny? I think these questions are excellent.
We have more questions.
Yeah, okay, let's keep going.
Quicker than we can answer them. So this is a really interesting one. Are there any geographical variables that were applied across the research? So, for example, would responses differ from city workers versus people in the Hills District who may live and work locally?
Yeah, great question.
We did. We didn't drill down into the working from home cohort, nor generally on the attitudes. We did look at some geographical differences. For example, just a couple of little highlights. We asked what you've seen, what characteristics or Aussie values you've seen play out in this COVID situation. And the number one response was the Aussie sense of humour. You know, we have the ability to laugh in the midst of great troubles as Aussies. You know, that stop laughing, this is serious sort of approach does dominate. We found that 1 in 3 people in New South Wales, Victoria, have seen that Aussie sense of humour. You know, the gallows humour almost. But more than half of all those in Queensland have seen it. So a bit more humour up north than down south. Little nuances like that. I think one difference, though, around the workplace is that in the Hills, it's more of a SME environment rather than a big corporate environment. And therefore, we are seeing businesses go back a bit earlier than the big corporates. The CBD of Sydney will remain a bit emptier than Norwest Business Park for a little longer. Just because smaller businesses by their size can practice social distancing. They can gather quite in a relaxed way because they've got fewer numbers and they can handle that. The big corporates will be a bit slower to get back into the normal way. So that's one little nuance that comes through because of our business size by region.
Interesting question. Jenny, any other questions? I think there are.
Yes. Do you feel that this could be a warning for the bricks and mortar retailers that are not innovating, so in terms of having an online presence?
Yeah, totally. You know, a crisis like this does wash through, and anything that was marginal, anything that didn't have an efficient business or a unique selling point does get becomes a casualty. And I think bricks and mortar, unless they're really adding value, they've got great confidence. I mean, we're nearly 20 years into online retailing, and Australians have become quite sophisticated with their purchasing. They've extended the categories. It's not just commodities or even certain fashions. They're moving right across what they were and are comfortable purchasing online. So that's a big challenge. And you know, we're focusing on COVID, and people might say, well, this will pass, and it will, of course. But we have entered a new era where people are aware of the impact of some of these practices on the passing on of illness. One little aside outcome of this has been the extremely low rate of influenza this season. Now, I was just looking up the Influenza Coalition data on this. It's quite remarkable. So last year in May, there were 3,000, just over 3,300 actually, lab confirmed cases of influenza. This May so far, 97 cases. So not only have we stopped COVID in its tracks, we've stopped influenza in its tracks. And let me put it in perspective. Last year, more than 3,000 Australians died of the flu. We've had 99 deaths so far, tragically, of COVID. But we will save multiple more lives this year because of our social distancing from the flu than we saved from COVID. Probably more than 2,000 saved lives with reduced morbidity from flu because of these practices. Now, when that starts to be analysed post-COVID, people will say, wow, well, a couple of thousand lives saved through this, maybe not the extent of the lockdowns that we've seen, but just the general hygiene practices will be to some extent maintained, particularly in our winters and our flu seasons. So some of these new practices will be here to stay.
Very interesting. That leads me to think also around how the economy will transition too, because clearly what's inherent in that perspective is our investment in health and the whole health industry, which was on a booming trajectory anyway, just given the aging population. And I'm sure you've got some stats around that too. You would think would be a further fillip to that industry too. And certainly in terms of the online space, I'm certainly seeing that organizations that weren't online at all are jumping on online now and really reaping the benefit of that. The other thing I'm seeing too is in supply chain management, where organizations were bringing in products from overseas. Now they're again starting to look more locally. And I can only see that post September, there'll be a resurgence of, and hopefully a strategic resurgence of support and funding for kind of manufacturing industries. So it'd be interesting to touch on whether you're seeing particular industries that are beneficial. But I'll come back to the questions again because I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask their questions. Jenny, any other questions for us?
There are some more. Firstly, just a reminder to put your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat box.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question I would really love to hear the answer to. So, do you think there'll be a sociological shift in our sense of time, impacting our deadline-driven work culture and the speed of life, or will this bounce back?
Interesting. Yeah,
we're all very slow at the moment, and I'm kind of no netball on the weekends, and I'm loving it. But
well,
do you think, this will all just we go back to before COVID-19?
I mean, eventually we will head back to a bit faster pace than we've got now, and we'll probably head back to being a bit more hard-driven and perhaps hard-nosed than we are now. But certainly the time that we're in, it's great just to be in it, where there is a lot more graciousness to each other. We are all in it together. The metaphors from our national leaders are, we're crossing a bridge, we're crossing it to a sort of a new zone. We will get through this, but we need to do it together and support each other on the way. And that sense of empathy and care for the vulnerable is a good Aussie trait, and that will continue, as I said, for some time, this renewed priority where relationships, family, caring for others, and being aware of our behaviours on others, living in a way of community. That's why we're limiting, even though we know that the chances of us getting this thing is pretty low, we want to be part of the solution. We're downloading the COVID app, and we're limiting our own travel to be dutiful citizens and community minded. And I think a lot of that will live on. We'll be more aware of our behaviours and have empathy with others, and maybe a bit of sensitivity towards others and their concerns over this. However, inevitably, once the crisis passes, we will speed up a bit. We'll get back into some of those old activities and probably get a bit more focused on productivity and outcomes and all of that. But certainly it's a great season to remind us of the importance of the timeless and the values and the pace of life. We even looked at things like, what have you set in place now that you want to continue post-COVID? And it was quite interesting. People, the number one response, more than half of respondents said spending more time with family and household members, enjoying a slower pace of life, prioritizing financial savings. Now there's a new one. We'd forgotten about savings. Yeah. It was all about spending and being comfortable in credit and moving from one job to the next. Suddenly, actually having a safety net, being aware of the fact that things go up, but they also go down, and you can lose your job, and savings matters. Things like enjoying more off-screen activities. People say they're going to continue that. Continuing the new exercise routine that they've picked up, maybe saved a few dollars from their memberships and working from home. So I think a lot of this we will take with us into the new era as well.
So that brings us full circle right to the issue of leadership. And if I think of business and leaders, CEOs, management teams, all of whom have gone through the same range of emotions that you talked about that society is going through. But it's also probably highlighted skills that need to be developed. Do you have a perspective on the kind of range of new skills that now organizations and particularly leadership teams need to be working on? I do, but I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, no, keen to hear yours, Anthony. I mean, a couple of brief points from me on the research. Number one is being able to, it's the same stuff leaders have always done, but doing it in a new way. So how can we build our team culture when we're not physically present?
Yes.
How can we train and equip staff when we're not face to face?
Yes.
How can we get the alignment on task when we have less visibility and daily connection? How can we enhance our skills, our ownership and our leadership development when we can't mentor and train as much compared to the in situ approach? So it's the timeless leadership practices. They don't change, but in a new context, you need new ways to deploy it. And one other thing I'll say on this, we used our national and political state leaders as a case study to look at in this report, because we found their ratings are off the charts. Aussies are saying, hey, the PM and our Premier and our Chief Health Minister officers, they've done a sterling job. High vote of confidence and trust in them. The most trusted source at the moment for information is the government source, not any other source out there. So we are very much getting behind our leaders, and we've appreciated how they've responded. So we asked, what have you looked for in a leader in a time of crisis? And Aussie said 4 things. Number one, be completely open and transparent with information. And I think we can all learn from that as we lead through tough times. Don't sugarcoat it. Be honest, be upfront. As soon as we know, share it. That was the first point. The second point Aussie said is be prepared to make the tough calls and back yourself. We can always, second guess ourselves and wonder if this path or that was better. But Aussies are saying, just set forward the path, step forward confidently, communicate that confidence and back yourself. The third was access to the experts. And we've seen that at a national level. It's not just the Prime Minister, it's the Chief Medical Officer. It's not just the Premier, it's the health officials. So access the best expertise and be guided by that was the third principle of leaders that we have seen as Aussies in this crisis. And the fourth one is show empathy and concern. And so I love the mix that Australians picked up there, that you've got the strong leader, backing themselves, making the tough calls, stepping forward, projecting confidence, but also the empathy, the care and the engagement with people. And both of those need to be carried together.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's fantastic, Mark. I really, really appreciate that. And you hadn't shared that with me before this webinar, so that was really great learning for me. I'd written down a couple too. One is vulnerability. I think that CEOs and leaders that are able to be vulnerable, well, in part because they've had no choice, because people have not had the answers, right? And typically, CEOs and senior leaders in organization think it as a badge of honor that they have to have the right answer or a right to be decisive, etc. But this has forced a level of vulnerability that translates, and you use the term graciousness, and I call it humanity, where people have realized, we're humans in this thing together, and it's kind of weird, and we're not really quite sure which way's up. Let's kind of figure it out together. And so that shared purpose, and one of the things that I really recommend to leaders is think about how you can take what the experience of this shared purpose into the post-COVID situation. What are the activities, what are the behaviors that you're doing through this process that once that common enemy is not there, that you can retain? I really invite people to think about that. Look, we're meant to be 45 minutes, but I go on till 2 o'clock if we have some more questions. Jenny, do we have any more questions? Otherwise, we might sum up.
Plenty more questions.
Plenty more questions. Okay.
Plenty more questions.
Okay. Couple more questions.
Not going home yet, guys. So people have been gathering as a community since ancient Greek times. And if we accept the rise of online retailers and the shrinkage of shopping centres, what will be the new place where people gather? I'm thinking particularly for teenagers who love to go down to Westfield and meet their friends.
Great question. Great question.
It is a great question. We constantly ask this question in our polling, in our annual studies. What for you, we ask Australians, is where you get that local connection. We know we can jump online. We know we've got community through social media, but in terms of that community where you live, what is the expression? And we consistently find up in the top echelons are things like the pubs and clubs, where people feel a sense of community, the cafe culture. The local shopping strip is one of the strongest ones, not just the destination shopping centre, but that little local shop strip up the road, where you've got the little food court perhaps, or the takeaway, where the community barbecue is on a weekend, where the fete is on, and indeed where the cafes are. That rates very strongly. And you've also got the local community centre, particularly these days, the outdoor park or grounds, the dog-free leash area, or the community park. So those sorts of things are important. So and then for those with primary school kids, it's the local public school or the local school environment, and for others, it's local church and gathering point. But post-COVID, it's interesting because all of those, almost every gathering point has been brought to a halt. And yet we know, as the questioner says, that we are hardwired for the need to interact, not just through a screen, but to connect and to put an arm on a shoulder and to see a smile and to share a story. That's how we are as humans, and we will need that, and we will go back to that. And I think that it's going to be a bit more, I guess, ad hoc or self-planned. We have done well in this through gathering with people outdoors. We've done well with connecting, even around a cuppa, but in an outdoor environment, or go for a walk together, these sorts of things. So I think we'll see a bit more of that outdoor lifestyle, a bit more of the gathering in a park and that sort of thing. The cafe will remain, but we'll see a lot more of the al fresco. Those food courts won't just be indoors, but outdoors into the future. And we'll make the most of this great climate and great landscape that we have in Australia. I think that we will see changes to those communal gathering places indoors, the way that churches and community halls operate, the way our gathering points work. There'll be certainly some short-term, probably some medium to long-term changes there. And the big shopping centre will be under a bit of a threat in terms of its big destination pull, where you end up with hundreds and hundreds of people. I think that some of the allure of that is fading, and it's going to go back a bit more to that local shopping centre that might have felt it was the poor cousin to the big shopping centre, but has its own benefit now. Easy to park, fewer people walk in and out from the front door, rather than have to move through a big mass of people as you get in the centres. So a new heyday, I'd say, for the local and smaller shopping centre.
Great. Thank you, Mark. One final question, Jenny, if there is one. Otherwise, I'll sum up.
There's a few. Okay, here's one that
question.
Could be quite interesting.
Pick the best question, Jenny. No pressure.
Oh, well, that's too much pressure. Too much pressure. What about this sort of travel ban, everyone's staying at home? What sort of effects has that had on road accidents and road deaths nationally?
Oh, that's an interesting question too.
It's a fascinating one. And just like we have saved hundreds of lives from the flu because of this, we will have saved many lives from road trauma as well. Now, the data's not out on that. It does tend to be compiled annually rather than flu, because of the nature in a flu season. It's compiled week by week. So we won't have the national data or indeed other causes of death for a year, but it will have impacts on that. It's even having impacts on things like our environmental footprint. Actually, that was one of the things that Australians were saying with the work from home, that they just feel good that they've had a far smaller environmental impact in this time. So I think the impact, while the focus has been keeping us all safe from coronavirus, the unintended beneficial consequences flow far beyond that. As we said, to our relationships, our family, our time, our mental health, as we've got a bit more balance in things, let alone to our physical health in some of these other areas as well. So I think there'll be long-term benefits which we'll want to sustain, even though we need to move back to a more normal approach. So yeah, lots of silver linings in this coronavirus cloud, which I'm happy to say we've seen and which will continue.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm going to have one final question for you in a second, Mark, which is a question without notice. But just before I do that, I want to remind people again that the link to Mark's research is in the chat box. So please jump into the chat box and have a look at that research, and has Mark's contact details in there as well. Jenny, perhaps if you could also put in there the link to the Lead Your Industry events that are coming up. My next Leading Conversations chat is on June the 9th with Phil Maul, who's a partner with CSIRO's Main Street Ventures, and we're going to be talking about reimagining your business and opportunities. We also then have a CEO luncheon with Ross Lamplugh. The CEO luncheons are invitation only, but if you're interested in receiving an invitation, drop us a line, and we'll think about putting you on the list. And finally, there's a workshop I'm running online, which is all about reimagining your business, which I believe is on the 11th of June, and that's only a 3-hour session. Bring a team of up to 4 to work through that rethinking and put that SWAT team together to deconstruct and to reconstruct your business. I'd really like to thank Mark McCrindle, but I'm going to thank him by asking him a question without notice, because I love his insight and perspective. Mark, what's the thing that has perhaps surprised you in the research? What's the unexpected results of the research that you've done? You thought, wow, go figure. I wouldn't have thought that. And again, that's a question without notice. So,
well, it's a classic, great question. The thing that surprised me in this whole COVID thing was the panic buying. I didn't think that we would see that in Australia. When we started seeing in other countries, people asked me, will we see it here? I thought, we tend to keep things in perspective. So I didn't expect to see empty shelves in our supermarkets for so long. So we ran research on it, and we asked, have you bought more than you've needed? And here's what we found. The panic buying, the shortages that we experienced was because just 6% of Australians strategically stockpiled, just 6%. And that was enough to blow out the supply chain that we've had. In fact, that 6% of strategic stockpilers led another 30% to buy more than they ordinarily would because they got a bit panicked, and that was the panic buying. And 2/3 of Australians bought less than they normally would because it wasn't available. So it does show how we've got a finely tuned machine. Supermarkets, they're in the business, they do it well, quick turnover, daily regular turnover. And it only took 6% of Australians buying more than the model's forecast to blow that whole thing out and cause 2 months of problems in Australia. So that was the surprise. It was a positive surprise, though, that the majority of Australians, more than 9 in 10, said we should not buy more than we need, only buy what we need. But there's always going to be a 6% out there that upset the apple cart, and that's what we saw.
I think there's a lot of secret hoarders out there, because I asked this question of every single person. I said, have you bought toilet paper today? And nobody I spoke to had ever purchased any. So I think there was a lot of silent sort of after hours, 10, 11 o'clock at night, going out there on the hunt, I think. But yeah, that's a great one. And it kind of showed you how the supply chain in Australia had really become very well oiled in a just-in-time perspective, hasn't it? Of course, there's a benefit to that, and it's highlighted the strategic potential weakness of that too. Mark, again, I would like to, on behalf of all the attendees here, thank you for sharing your insights and your research. It's always a pleasure to have you come and talk to our groups. Thank you so much indeed. I'd also like to thank everyone attending for some great questions that came up there too. And in fact, this whole webinar has been so excellent, Mark. I think it's really important that we do this again, maybe in 6 or 8 weeks' time, if you're okay to do that. And because one thing we can guarantee is in 6 or 8 weeks' time, the situation will be different again, right?
Definitely.
And so there'll be new learning. You'll have updated research. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm hearing Mark committing to attending us again in about 8 weeks. Is that okay for everyone?
Happy to.
Great. Mark, thank you. And Jenny, thank you for moderating the questions there. We might capture all those questions actually and circulate them to attendees too. And if we've got some feedback and some comments and stuff, we can put that out there as well. So again, thanks everybody for attending. It's now 2 o'clock. Fantastic. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks again, Mark.